It has been revealed that the medical profession has a problem with sexual harassment, gender discrimination, strong gender biases, and sex-based abuses of power. The hierarchical organization of power within medical training, the enormous debt incurred from medical education, along with virtually no lateral mobility during residency training, create an extraordinary steep power gradient between junior residents, their supervising attendings, and hospital administrators. This steep gradient of influence sets the stage for abuses of power, which are similar in dynamic to those that occur within domestic violence and child abuse within family relationships. Currently, many leaders within the medical field are discussing the importance of zero-tolerance policies to address specifically sexual harassment, but sexual harassment is a symptom of a much greater social diagnosis of misogyny and unequal power between the sexes as shown through various societies' gender roles. In an effort to gain insights into how to develop an effective zero-tolerance policy that not only addresses sexual harassment, but also the greater problem of abuse of power associated with gender, Barry Goldstein, who is council member and co-chair of the Child Custody Task Group for NOMAS, will be interviewed today. NOMAS stands for the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. Barry Goldstein is one of the leading national and international experts regarding domestic violence. He practiced law for 30 years representing the victims in domestic violence cases. He is a nationally recognized domestic violence author, speaker, and advocate. He is the co-editor of Domestic Violence, Abuse, and Child Custody, co-author of Representing Domestic Violence Survivor, and author of Scared to Leave, Afraid to Stay, and The Quincy Solution, Stop Domestic Violence and Save $500 billion. He has worked in the domestic violence movement since 1983 and has worked as an instructor in a New York model batterer program since 1999. Barry has been a featured speaker at every Battered Mother's Custody conference and has spoken to many organizations, including the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, OVW in the U.S. Justice Department, the American Psychological Association, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, National Domestic Violence Hotline, the Oklahoma Attorney General's Office, among many others. Good afternoon, Barry, and thank you so much for agreeing to give this interview with Resident Bold. I'm going to go into more detail with your role with NOMAS and what you do for them.
Okay, I'm happy to be here. As part of my work with NOMAS, I am a council member, and the council is the governing body, so we meet twice a year to make whatever decisions are needed, for NOMAS. Most of my work for NOMAS is as co-chair of the Child Custody Task Group. And, as doing that, I would be involved in research, writing articles, supporting amicus briefs in cases that are of interest to us, working with our allies. Basically, the child custody system is broken and routinely sends children to live with abusers, and we are doing whatever we can to make people aware of that and to try to change the broken system.
That sounds like a very, very daunting task, and congratulations for all your hard work dealing with can be a very tragic situation in many cases and fighting the good fight. Despite all of the challenges that you and I'm sure many others have been facing, why did you decide to join NOMAS?
One of the big problems, there is an active, they call themselves a father's rights group, but it's really an abuser's rights group. And they've had outside influence over the courts and sometimes the legislatures. And what the abusers do is they want to make it out as if the dispute in custody courts is between mothers and fathers. And that's wrong. The dispute is between the vast majority of good mothers and fathers who want to make sure that children are protected against a small group of extreme abusers who are using and manipulating the courts to regain what they believe is their right to control their victims. And so I believed that it would be really helpful to have a primarily male organization supporting protective mothers. And NOMAS was already on that side. But as I got involved, we were able to do much more, to help protect the mothers and to speak on their behalf, particularly in terms of answering the abuser rights groups.
What year was NOMAS formed?
It was about 40 years ago. It was long before I was involved.
Wow. So basically, NOMAS was way ahead of the game, well before he for she then, correct? After the Me Too movement.
Yes, they have been doing good work for a long time. And, my co-chair on the Child Custody Task Force, Jack Straighton, was doing some really wonderful work long before I joined.
Approximately how many domestic abuse victims have you had as clients so far?
I would say about 1,000.
That's a lot.
Yes, I mean, both when I used to be an attorney and now as an expert witness and consultant, between the different roles that I played, I think it would come to about that.
What were the main overarching points that you learned from working with these victims?
One of the best things I did when I first got involved was really to keep my mouth shut and listen to women, because women know what it's like to be mistreated by men. They know how it impacts them. And so it was important for me to learn from them before I started, doing any kind of advocating or writing or anything else. And so I learned an awful lot from not just my women clients, but also people who were in my sister's place, which is a battered women's shelter that I worked with for many years, and the director of the Batterer program, and Mo Hanna, who's my writing partner for some of my books. And, so I've been privileged to work with some really smart women who I've been able to learn from. And, I think it's a good idea for men to listen to women.
Barry, you're absolutely preaching to the choir, and I think you're preaching to the choir to not only women around the world, but also physicians too. I think, as a physician, one thing that in our training that we learn going through medical school is to do just that, shut up and listen. And that listening is probably one of the biggest ways of establishing trust with people. Sadly, because of the economics and the business model of medicine, it prevents us from really allowing us to listen the way that we should and the way that we want to. And people definitely feel rushed in that process. You must deal with some really painful and traumatizing experiences. And, what keeps you going?
When I was a young attorney, I had a case in which 3 children told their mother that their father had physically and sexually abused them. And my client did everything right. She sought a protective order, she sought custody, and she filed a complaint with the Child Protective Services. And initially, they limited the father to supervised visits in order to protect the children. And the children told the judge, told the evaluator, told their attorney, told the caseworker what their father had done. And as usually happens in these cases, these professionals all assumed that the mother had coached the children to say this. And so they decided to resume visitation, and they threatened the mother, the judge did, that if she didn't stop, she would lose the children altogether. And before the first visit could occur, the family babysitter confronted the father in the presence of the law guardian, and the father admitted kissing his daughters on their privates. And the law guardian immediately made a motion to stop the visitation, which I joined. And the judge spoke with the evaluator, and the evaluator said that the father showed bad judgment, but there was no reason to stop the visitation.
Wow.
During that first visitation, the 4-year-old was penetrated for the first time. I called Child Protective because they didn't know about the father's admission. And so I made a new report. When the judge found out, yelled and screamed at me, "How dare you? They already investigated. They found nothing." But this time, there was a different caseworker, did a thorough investigation, found that the father had done even worse than we believed. And so they brought charges against the father. He never again had anything beyond supervised visits. The mother won custody and invited myself and the caseworker to a dinner to celebrate her getting custody. And the children had gifts for us, but most of all was what they called us. They called us believers because we believed them when all the professionals who were there to protect them didn't believe them. And so at that point in my career, I learned that there was no greater honor than to be called a believer.
Well, you've certainly redefined the terms of religion there, Barry. You have me absolutely in tears. That's an incredibly powerful story.
That story is why I wrote my first book.
That should be a film written threefold. And sadly, our media focuses more on the perversions of romantic and intimate relationships and family dynamics than on the work that you do, which is so very brave, bold, and above and beyond desperately needed.
Thank you.
What were the main overarching points that you learned about domestic violence itself at its core?
Well, it's important to understand domestic violence is not caused by mental illness, by substance abuse, by anger management issues. That's what was believed 40 years ago. And even today, many professionals who should know better continue to think that. It's based on sexism, and it's based on a widespread belief that husbands and boyfriends are entitled to control their partners, make her do what he wants, and will use a variety of tactics to do that. And most of these tactics are not physical. There are a whole variety of tactics that abusers use. And again, most of the professionals, they focus only on physical abuse and they miss all the other kind of tactics that are used. And that's one of the reasons that so often true reports of abuse are disbelieved. So the purpose of domestic violence is not to inflict the most pain or because the man enjoys inflicting pain. It's to enforce what they believe is their right to control their partner.
Wow. So basically, this abuse of power, or essentially what is an abuse of power, has been mistakenly displaced as a mental health illness.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons we get it wrong. And, in child custody cases, they use mental health professionals as if they were the experts on domestic violence. And when they find that the father doesn't have a mental health problem, which is most of the time, they assume that means that he couldn't be an abuser.
Based on what you've seen anecdotally and from current scientific research, do domestic violence abusers have a particular social, economic, or personality profile or an education level?
Not at all. Abusers come in all ethnic groups, economic background, education, because everyone lives in the same society that has sent messages for thousands of years that men are better and more valuable than women, that men are entitled to control women. And these messages go throughout society and have continued, as I said, for a very long time.
And so essentially what it is an institutionalized systemic oppression of the divine feminine.
Yes, and if you think about it, for thousands of years, the laws said that it was acceptable for husbands to control, to punish, to assault their wives. the first law in the United States about what we would now call domestic violence said that husbands met their wives on Sunday. So any other day it was acceptable. And until about 30 or 40 years ago, there was no criminal consequences for what we now call domestic violence. And so even though the laws have changed, many people still living, remember growing up in homes where they saw their fathers abusing their mothers and there was no consequence to their father. So that sent the message that this behavior is acceptable. And one of the important things to understand about this is that there's that long history of men abusing women. There's no equivalent history of society allowing or encouraging wives to abuse or assault their husbands. And so attempts to create a false equivalency between what men do and what women do is fundamentally flawed.
In fact, it seems that if women show any kind of rebuke or strong emotional aggression or anger in response to those injustices, that they are socially punished.
Yes, very much so. And, what we know, I'm sure we'll talk about the ACE research later, but what we know is that most of the harm from domestic violence is not the immediate physical injuries, but it's living with the fear and which leads to stress. And so if a woman hits back out of frustration or anger, it doesn't make her partner afraid of her. He's not afraid she's going to kill him or seriously harm him. But the opposite is true, that women often are afraid that that's exactly what their partners will do.
You mentioned about the laws that, they haven't really changed since 40 years ago that, recognize domestic violence and in fact kind of reinforce this acceptability that the only time women were not allowed to be abused was on a Sunday. How then have you seen any relationship between the strength of the abuse, living together versus marriage?
Well, the main difference is that when you're married, it's harder to get out of the relationship. A bigger problem is when you have children together, because it has become a standard abuser tactic to use the children to regain control over the mother, because abusers understand that the best way to hurt a mother is to hurt the children. But other than that, whether you're married or not, it's a problem. Lots of times women are trying to leave and he doesn't want them, allow them to leave. 3/4 of domestic violence homicides are committed after she leaves. So it's not the kind of emotional outburst, because something happened and he suddenly got angry. It's a planned attack. A lot of people don't understand, domestic violence dynamics.
Did you observe that abusers or victims had a particular family dynamic growing up as children?
Well, here's the thing. What the research shows is that boys who witness domestic violence are more likely to grow up and abuse their partners. Girls who witness domestic violence are more likely to be victims of abusers. But what is important to know is that doesn't have to happen. There are some really wonderful men who grew up with domestic violence, and it sent a message to them that they didn't want that to happen anymore. And so they became leaders trying to prevent domestic violence. So the point is that just because you grew up witnessing that doesn't mean that you have to repeat that. And two wonderful examples. As a Yankee fan, I'm very pleased to say Joe Torre, who was a longtime manager of the Yankees, set up Safe at Home, with an organization to prevent domestic violence. And Mark Wynn, who is one of the leading law enforcement trainers about domestic violence, both of them grew up under horrific circumstances as children, but instead of repeating the behavior, they work to prevent it. So having that history doesn't mean you have to repeat it.
That's amazing. Do people know the percentage of how many men achieve those levels of emotional intelligence that you've described despite having faced such a horrific family dynamic growing up?
I'm not aware of any research like that.
Many people wonder how a victim could become associated and then emotionally and or financially attached to an abuser. Based upon what victims have told you, how does that happen?
You know, it's interesting. When domestic violence first became a public issue, we had no research. And initially, they were assuming that there was something about the woman that caused her to be abused by her partner. As they finally figured out how to do the research, they found out that the difference between women who were abused and women who would not be abused is nothing. There is no difference. It's all about the man, which is really important to understand. So all the common practices of blaming the woman are just wrong.
There seems to be a lot of projection as a defense mechanism that's going on.
Absolutely. And of course, standard abuser tactics is to blame the woman, that, I wouldn't have to hit you if you didn't burn the carrots kind of thing.
Domestic violence has a variety of types of abuse, including, as you mentioned, physical and sexual assault, which is what gets the most attention, but also financial control, social control, among emotional abuse and psychological abuse. And based upon what you have seen, are there some forms of abuse that are more common than others? And have you observed a relationship between the types of abuse and the demographic of the abuser or the victim?
Well, I think that abusers who are wealthy are less likely to use physical abuse, certainly more likely to use economic abuse. But things like isolating behaviors and monitoring behaviors, psychological behaviors, I think are more common. Probably the least common form of domestic violence is physical abuse. And again, as you said, that's what courts and professionals tend to focus on. But what tends to happen is that the abuser will have used physical abuse once or twice. And after that, she knows what he's capable of. And the other tactics are a constant reminder, that she better behave or else, he might hit her again.
How does domestic violence impact the healthcare system?
That's huge, and I wish people understood it better. Until several years ago, when we were using the ACE research more, if you looked for research, it would have said that in the United States, we're spending between $5 and $8 billion a year on healthcare costs. But all that was doing was figuring out the cost of treating her immediate wounds. When you consider ACE, which is adverse childhood experiences, and you look at all of the harm that's caused by fear and stress, and mental illness and things of that sort, it's much greater. So that we know in the United States, we are spending $750 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars every year to allow men to abuse women. That's a really exciting statistic in the sense that that amount of money could and should be an incentive for public officials who may not be feminists to try to prevent domestic violence, because a large part of that money could be saved by using best practices to prevent domestic violence.
That's an absolutely astonishing figure. And I think that a lot more leaders in the medical profession should, in particular public policy, should be aware of those statistics just from the sheer number. And I'd be, more than happy to go over those numbers with you at another time so that we can figure out how to get that out there. But one of the studies that is very important and is a crucial part of the work that you do is the adverse childhood experience studies, or the ACE studies. which are poignant research from the CDC. How does this research impact your work on domestic violence, and how should it impact the work of medical professionals?
It really should change everything. When I do presentations, I often compare the ACE research to the 1964 Surgeon General's report that found the connection between smoking and cancer. Because what society did was they took that information and did just a bunch of things, from doctors educating their patients to taxes on cigarettes, particularly to discourage children from smoking. And the result is that we dramatically reduced the number of people smoking, and that saved millions of lives, billions, probably trillions of dollars. It was a huge difference. And ACE gives us the same opportunity. I had the privilege, when I was writing my Quincy book, to work with Dr. Vincent Felitti, who is the lead author of the original ACE study. And what he said is that he now believes prevention is the best use for his research. And what that means is we know how to dramatically reduce domestic violence and child abuse. If we do that, we are going to save hundreds of billions of dollars every year. It's going to change society in the most wonderful ways. And of course, the human costs are even greater. So that creates just an enormous opportunity. In the work that I do, I'm working in child custody cases involving domestic violence and child abuse. And what ought to be happening is we should be calculating what is the ACE score of the children, and we need to figure out how do we reduce the fear and stress. Because when I interviewed doctors working with the ACE research, I asked them the question that ought to be the number one question for courts, and that is, when a child has been exposed to one or more ACEs, is there anything we can do now to save them from the awful consequences? And the consequences are shorter life and a lifetime of health and social problems. And the answer was yes, we can do that. The child is going to need both medical treatment and therapy, both to deal with immediate problems as they develop, but also to reduce the stress. And the other thing is they can't be exposed to more abuse, which means that until an abuser changes his behavior, he shouldn't have anything beyond supervised visits. So, I mean, it makes perfect sense. And this is research from the CDC, highly credible. And 20 years after the first ACE study was published, the ACE study is rarely used in any of the courts. So they keep getting their cases wrong, and they keep destroying children's lives.
The numbers and the profound effect that this study has, not only at a legal system level, but also, from a social evolution standpoint, but also from a healthcare maintenance and chronic illness prevention standpoint, ACE seems to have an absolutely profound effect on all of these matters. I'm just wondering, how much of leaders in my profession have integrated this into their daily practices, in particular in pediatrics, which would be something I'm sure would need to be discussed further.
Well, let's talk about directly what's going on here. For thousands of years, we have tolerated behavior that we would now call domestic violence and child abuse. When you had the spate of domestic violence and child abuse cases from the NFL, got a lot of publicity, and in many cases, the players were saying that all they did was what they had seen growing up. And they were telling the truth, because the present level of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, mental illness, suicide, crime, all sorts of health and social problems are based on our level of domestic violence and child abuse. To say it a much better way, if we were to use best practices to prevent domestic violence and child abuse, those horrific diseases would be reduced. ACE can do more than the Surgeon General's report because included in the benefits is that it would reduce smoking and it would also reduce so many other problems. So that it's so exciting what we could do. You would think someone in a leadership position would work to bring these benefits to our society by working to prevent DV and child abuse. And we went to Hawaii to promote the Safe Child Act, which is the legislation that would solve the child custody cases. And I'm forgetting whether it was the Cancer Society or the Heart Association, but we met with a lobbyist for one of those groups. And think about it for a second. Their work is to prevent cancer and heart disease. Based on the ACE research, reducing child abuse and domestic violence ought to be an integral part of their work, just as preventing smoking is now. If we understood the consequences, this is the most wonderful opportunity that we have. And I think what's most frustrating is that we really aren't using it the way we could.
What do you think are the biggest barriers that we have as a society that is, preventing this message from really taking hold? And the reason why I bring this up is because we had previously discussed kind of the relationship between the power dynamic and domestic violence and how they are essentially exactly the same as they are in residency training. And so you have this dynamic of domestic violence that's actually integrated actually within medical training. So when it's actually a part of the social constructs within medicine itself, when we're trying to be healers, it's very, very difficult then to overcome those power dynamics and actually apply them or apply the exact opposite of the way physicians have been trained because of the hierarchy. What allows this, do you think, to flourish?
Well, of course, there is a long history of men controlling government and industry and medicine and all sorts of other organizations. We've made some progress, but in most professions and certainly still in government, overwhelmingly it is men making decisions. It is very easy for men to be oblivious to how their behavior impacts women and to the harm that sexism and domestic violence has on women. I grew up in the same society. I had the same values and beliefs as most men. I mean, I learned differently when I got involved in the domestic violence movement, and I got involved sort of accidentally. It wasn't that was what I thought was going to be my life's work. So I understand where men are getting their beliefs from, but I think, we need to change that. And when I learned the enormous financial benefits, I thought that might be the incentive to make the changes that we need. Society would be so much wealthier aside from having more enjoyable lives. That would seem like a huge incentive. That's why I wrote my Quincy book. But so far, we haven't had the changes that are needed.
Knowing what you know as an attorney who has worked with domestic abuse victims for 30 years in your work on the Quincy solution, if you were sitting at a table with hospital administrators or leadership in medical education, what would you say are the most important aspects of an effective zero tolerance policy, not only in its prevention of sexual harassment, but also sex-based abuses of power in residency programs?
Well, one of the things that's really important here is that domestic violence, and the same thing is true of sexual harassment or sexual assault are different than most crimes in the sense that other crimes have always been crimes. There was never a time when arson or bank robbery was tolerated. But there's a long history of gender-based crimes being tolerated. One of the reasons that there's a problem in the medical profession, as there's a problem in so many other areas, is that men expect that if they sexually harass or assault women, that there will be no consequences to the man. And the reason they believe that is that historically there hasn't, and today there rarely is. In Quincy, what happened was they used a series of strong practices. They strictly enforced criminal laws, orders of protection, probation rules. And the result was a dramatic reduction in domestic violence crimes and especially homicide. A community that had averaged 5 or 6 DV homicides enjoyed several years in a row with none, and then there was one, and then there was none. And the reason for that is that the message got out that in Quincy, if you commit a crime, there are going to be consequences. So men who are smart, just as women are smart, figured out they can't do it in Quincy. So they stopped. And so the same thing would be true in the medical profession. If doctors and residents understood that if they mistreated a woman, that could be the end of their career or their reputation, so that there would be consequences to them, they would decide they don't want to give up their career. They don't want to give up their practices and all that, all the work that they've done to get to the point where they were. So they'd stop doing it. So it's really important to create consequences. The research about domestic violence is that only accountability and monitoring have changed men's behavior. And we tend to focus on all sorts of other issues, as we talked about before, like mental health or substance abuse. And these are just like abuse excuses. It's sort of a way out for somebody rather than consequences. Consequences is what men need when they commit these kinds of acts. And more importantly, if they know that there are consequences, they won't commit the acts in the first place.
A lot of men's rights activists would say that there's a war against men because of being held accountable. What would be your, main argument against that? Because they could potentially say, well, if there has to be, accountability for us, then there has to be equal accountability for women when, as you say, historically, there really hasn't been a society that has promoted, women or specifically women abusing men, even though it I'm sure it does happen. It just there's such a skewed number towards male abusers. It seems that argument would be a bit flawed.
There's 2 answers I want to offer you. When I'm teaching in the batterer classes, and lots of times the men in the class or even men in the community will complain that our approach is anti-men. But what we're really saying is that all men have the ability and the intelligence and the control to treat women respectfully. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's saying something very positive about men. So why are these male groups objecting when we're saying something so positive? And it's really, as we were just saying, that the implication is, since you're capable of treating women properly, if you don't do it, it's reasonable to hold you accountable. The other thing I wanted to say is, also in the batterer class, I sometimes do a class about the history of domestic violence from the point of view of who do we hold responsible. And to give you the short version, we started out by blaming women, and that didn't work. we then said, well, maybe it's not just women, maybe it's both parties or the relationship. And again, that didn't work. And in both cases, we know it didn't work because during the time that was the primary response, there was no reduction in domestic violence, homicide, serious injuries, emergency room visits. It was only when we started to hold men accountable that these problems, particularly DV homicide, started going down. And what was interesting, there were some communities that were even more strict in holding men accountable, and the DV crime and especially homicides went way down in those communities. That's how we know it works.
Do you think that there's a gendered experience in the sense that when male abusers are being held accountable, it's more effective if the person of authority who is calling out the abuser is a male or a female?
Well, I think they don't like being ordered around by a woman, but I think the important thing is that there are consequences.
Barry, thank you so much for your time today and going into such detail about a very, very important topic that not only affects the domestic violence community, but also the medical profession and the entire evolution of our society.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you.